Good, okay. Well-informed group. Who here thinks they might be doing agroforestry or knows they're doing agroforestry already? Okay, great. I'll give my presentation here and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for discussion. So I welcome all your questions and conversation. But to kind of get things rolling, I'll just talk a little bit about the Savanna Institute and what we do. So the Savanna Institute, we're a nonprofit organization, and our focus is really on laying the groundwork for agroforestry in the Midwest. So our name is sometimes a little bit confusing for people. We're not doing oak savanna restorations. There are a lot of other great organizations that are doing that. Our focus is really on agroforestry, and there aren't that many other groups in our area that are doing that. So we're a relatively young organization. It was founded in 2013. And it was a very small organization up until around 2018 when we started growing into the fairly sizable organization we are now. And this is kind of the scope of our work. So there are a lot of stars up here, but the ones to pay attention to are the red stars, which is where we have offices, and then the gold stars is where we have demonstration farms that we manage ourselves. So if you can kind of focus in on those, you can tell that most of our work is in southern Wisconsin and central Illinois. Central Illinois is actually where the Savanna Institute started. It was a group of students and farmers and researchers who wanted to have more information about agroforestry and were having trouble finding it, so they started this organization to kind of network with each other. So we have offices in Madison, which is where I live and where I work, and then we also have an office and some farms in Spring Green, Wisconsin, which is right in our backyard here. So, what is agroforestry? Anyone want to try giving a definition? No takers. Oh.
It could be a tree farm, but it's not, probably, I bet.
Other thoughts?
Mixing agriculture and forestry.
Okay, mixing agriculture and forestry. Sounds good.
I guess I was thinking about edible forests, but that's probably just part of it. So.
Okay, I think these are all good answers, and agroforestry means a lot of different things to different people. We often kind of stick with the simplest definition that we work with, which is just farming with trees. It's anything that's using trees on a farm, using trees for agricultural purposes. And agroforestry can take a lot of different forms. I think the important thing to remember about agroforestry is that it's one of the oldest forms of agriculture. People have been farming with trees for thousands of years all over the world. So it's a new word for a very, very old type of agriculture. And it can look a lot of different ways, and we'll kind of get into that. And one of the things that I like about agroforestry, and one of the things that we talk about, is that it kind of gets us out of this black and white distinction between nature and agriculture. And I have a background in conservation and wildlife biology, and it felt like a lot of what we were trying to do was convince people to do less of something, do less agriculture, do less development, do less tillage or whatever, and try to return more land to some type of what we might call nature here. And the nice thing about agriculture is it's kind of a both and. So the idea is that we're trying to get farmland to function like a healthy ecosystem. And that's kind of where our name, the Savanna Institute, comes from, is that we have the oak savannas here, and we would love to see farmland that looks more like those oak savannas that used to be in this area, but that is still productive farmland and still providing food and fiber and other benefits for people, but also providing things like wildlife habitat and soil conservation and reducing runoff and flooding, and all these things that we also need our land to do. So we need our farmland, especially in the Midwest, to serve a lot of purposes, and agroforestry is an opportunity to kind of have it both ways in some cases. And we like to think of agroforestry as something that can offer solutions to people, whether those are financial challenges or whether they're looking at increasing biodiversity, whether they want more beauty on their land that they own. Agroforestry is something that can be a solution for them. So let's talk a little bit about what that actually looks like. So, as I mentioned, agroforestry exists all over the world. It can look 100 different ways, 1,000 different ways, especially when you get into the tropics. There's some very advanced agroforestry going on there. But here in our region, to kind of simplify it a little bit, the USDA has 5 agroforestry practices that it likes to talk about. And these are important for us because if you're looking for any cost share funding through USDA, you're going to end up talking about these 5 agroforestry practices. And these kind of help people visualize what it looks like on the ground. So the first one is windbreaks. I think everyone kind of understands the idea of a windbreak. It's maybe the most common type of agroforestry. It's been around since the Dust Bowl, and especially in places we work like in Illinois and Iowa where it's really good crop ground. Windbreaks are some of the only trees that you see for miles and miles. So we consider this a type of agroforestry because it's putting trees to work on farms. It's not just leaving them and ignoring them. So these are trees that are serving a purpose, which in this case is blocking the wind. And here's what that looks like at one of our demonstration farms in Illinois. This is a a very young windbreak. So this is a 3-row windbreak that we just planted within the last couple of years. And we're trying out a lot of different types of windbreaks on this particular farm. In this one, in the first row, we have fast-growing hybrid poplars. These are only a few years old, but they're already really tall. They have those great big leaves. One of the benefits of those hybrid poplars, especially in a place like Illinois, is they can help prevent pesticide drift. So during the growing season when there's pesticide in the air, those great big leaves on those trees can kind of be the first barrier that pesticide hits. And hybrid poplars grow really fast. We're not that worried about damaging them, but they can protect the crops or some of the other plants we have growing on the inside. So hybrid poplars on the outer row. In the middle row, we have a mix of evergreen trees, and evergreen trees are kind of ideal for windbreaks because they still work in the winter when other trees lose their leaves. So most windbreaks involve evergreens in some form. And then on that inside row, we've got a mix of shrubs that provide some type of fruit or nut that can be eaten by wildlife or potentially eaten by people. So this is something we're experimenting with, trying to think about how we can build an effective windbreak over various time scales that can also serve multiple purposes. So thinking about things that can serve multiple purposes is a big part of agroforestry because some of these trees, especially the ones that live longer, we don't know what we're going to need them to do in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. So we want to think about things that can serve multiple purposes down the road.
What are you planting between the tree rows?
Between the rows right now is what we call our low-mow mix. So that's just a mix of cool season grasses and clovers. And in other places we're experimenting with a prairie mix. But here we're just trying to keep it simple, so it's still perennial ground cover all year long, but just kind of keeping it low and keeping it out of the way. Our next example of agroforestry is riparian buffers. I think this one's also pretty intuitive. Instead of blocking the wind, riparian buffers are using trees to slow down water as it's flowing off of farms. Another thing about agroforestry that we often tell people is if you're interested in agroforestry, it's great along the edges. So don't take your best forest land or your best crop ground and try converting it to agroforestry. Start with some of the land you don't really know what to do with and think about that as a place to experiment. So some of these areas that might be prone to flooding or might have some water runoff issues, those could be good places to experiment with some agroforestry. And here's an example of a riparian buffer right down the road. This is on the Sugar River. Some of you probably even know where this flood is because you can put in boats on the Sugar River right there. But you can see where the trees have been planted to try to provide a barrier between the crop ground and the river. So one of the most common questions we get when people are interested in getting started with agroforestry is they want to know, what am I supposed to do while the trees are growing? So some of these crop trees we're working with, like chestnuts, might be 10 years before they start producing nuts, might be 20 or 25 years before they're at full capacity. So what are you supposed to do at that land while the trees are growing? And we've got 2 answers for that. So the first one is alley cropping. Alley cropping is when you're planting trees, but you're also growing stuff in between the rows of trees. And this picture is supposed to kind of illustrate how that can change over time. So when you first plant the trees and they're really small, you might be able to grow something like corn in between the rows, and we're doing that at some of our demonstration farms, and it won't be affected at all. As those trees get bigger, you might need to switch to something like a winter annual. And then as they get even bigger, it might be better to switch over to pasture, or maybe you're cutting hay in between those rows. And so that as the trees get bigger and you're starting to, as the trees are starting to become the primary focus of that land, the understory kind of decreases in importance, but that can take place over 10 or 20 years, or however long you need. Here's an example of a mature alley cropping system. This is actually in France. This is where one of our former executive directors named Kevin Bowles, who helped found the Savanna Institute, did a postdoc in France. And I think this is actually him running alongside the combine here, because that seems like something that he would do. But I think this is a really interesting example of how these trees are very large, as you can see, and they're still able to get their machinery in the rows in between. Another common question we get is, how far apart should you plant your trees if you're doing alley cropping? And the answer is, you take your biggest piece of machinery, you measure how wide it is, and that's how far apart you need to plant your trees. And maybe think about if you're going to be getting bigger machinery in the future. Yes?
What are they growing in between?
I was guessing it was some kind of winter annual. I don't know. Do you have a guess?
Is shading a problem?
Shading is definitely a factor, and yeah, we can talk more about that later, but that's one of the big things we're looking at. We're actually starting a multi-year research project on windbreaks to try to look at how the shading impacts the crops, but then also the wind reduction helps them. So trying to kind of quantify the loss of production due to loss of light versus the improvements due to the wind reduction. The other thing I wanted to say here is that one of the things we also talk about with agroforestry is that it makes it possible to increase productivity on a given piece of land. So you're growing something at ground level. As we mentioned, it's being shaded out, so it might be decreasing in production. But now you have a whole second enterprise on the same piece of land. So in some ways, it's almost like you're increasing the size of your farm, but instead of increasing it horizontally, you're increasing it vertically, because we're now farming at multiple levels. So that's something we talk about too, and the term for that is over-yielding, where you can actually have greater than 100% productivity, depending on how you want to measure that, because you're growing multiple things on the same piece of land.
Are those trees then producing a crop?
I don't know exactly what they were using these trees for. On our demonstration farms in Illinois, where we're doing a lot of this alley cropping, we met with a few different farmers down there, and they decided to pick tree species just for timber. So we're doing alley cropping down there. They're going to grow those trees and then harvest them for timber, and probably not. They didn't really want to mess around with fruit or nut production. So I think that would be the most common thing that people would do around here.
So what species do you use for that?
They're doing a variety. I might have to look that up. But yeah, they were using a few different trees for that. I know walnut, they were doing walnuts, some oaks. Yeah, I would have to look that one up. I appreciate all the questions. I'll try to keep going through these in case some of the questions get answered as we go. So we talked about alley cropping, and that's agroforestry with crops. Silvopasture is basically just agroforestry with livestock. So, as you can see in the photo, you've got trees and then you've got animals under the trees. This also happens all over the world. Here's an example of what it looks like in Georgia, which is a place that's been doing silvopasture for a while, because they would raise cattle in pine plantations.
Almost looks like a painting.
I think is what this is. So here in Wisconsin and in the Midwest, we have a history of unmanaged grazing in the woods, which is not a good thing and has caused a lot of damage. And that's not what silvopasture is. So part of our work at Savanna Institute is having to kind of explain that we're not trying to do unmanaged grazing in the woods. So with silvopasture, you're not just turning your animals loose and letting them do whatever they want. It should be done with rotational grazing, some type of managed grazing, and really you're managing three things with silvopasture. You're managing your livestock, you're managing your trees, and you're managing the forages underneath the trees. So you need to be doing all three, and if any one of those three things is not doing well, then your silvopasture is not doing well. So again, thinking about multiple enterprises on the same piece of land, with silvopasture, you got three things you got to pay attention to. So here's an example of what that looks like in the early stages. This is at a dairy farm in Pennsylvania, where they're just getting started planting some trees into pasture. A lot of the farmers, especially dairy farmers that we work with, their main interest in silvopasture is the shade, trying to lower the temperatures for their cattle because that translates directly to more milk production. As you can see in this picture, it also looks a little bit like alley cropping, so there are some similarities there. We're also, along with a farmer in Pennsylvania, kind of figuring out a system for planting trees where we can protect the trees with tubes and then also with electric fencing so that the cattle can just wander around the trees and walk under that fence that protects the trees. I didn't explain that very well. It's easier if you see a picture of it. But we're working on some new ways to try to protect these trees as we're establishing silvopasture. The last thing I'll say about silvopasture is there are two ways you can establish it, and they look very different. So this is silvopasture by addition, as we call it. They started with a pasture and they're planting trees into the pasture. The other way you can do it is silvopasture by subtraction, which is when you have a woodland that needs to get thinned out. Maybe it's got a lot of junk trees and brush. You thin it out and then you establish forage underneath. We call that silvopasture by subtraction. They end up in the same place, but they start out very differently. Silvopasture by addition takes a little longer to get going, but it's also a little bit gentler because things happen slowly. With silvopasture by subtraction, you're doing a big disturbance right at the start. You're going to end up probably with a lot of wood mulch or a lot of logs and timber and junk on the ground you have to deal with. But you also have these mature trees that are ready to go. So silvopasture by subtraction is more work up front, but you can kind of jump right into having a mature silvopasture a few years down the line. And then the last one of these practices I'll talk about is forest farming. This is one that is not as common around here. This is maybe more common in other parts of the country, but this is where you're growing specialty crops under a full forest canopy. So this might be things like ginseng or golden seal or mushrooms that grow best in a forest environment. So you're using that environment to grow some type of product. This is a farm near Janesville, Wisconsin. I don't know if anyone knows Ingrid, but she's doing a lot of interesting forest farming on her land. I would also consider maple production a form of forest farming. There's really a lot of potential here, I think. And I think that the cool thing about forest farming is that it's a way for people to pay more attention to any forests they have on their land and thinking about uses for it other than harvesting it for timber, which you can still do, but you might be able to get some other things out of it too. And it kind of gets people paying attention to what's growing in their forest.
What are they doing?
Yeah, good question. So they are inoculating a log here to grow mushrooms. And we have some videos about this on our website. But you can't really see it in the background, but Ingrid has a whole bunch of these logs laid out behind her house and just has mushrooms growing out of them, which is pretty neat. Okay, so those are the 5 agroforestry practices. I'm going to talk just a little bit more about what the Savanna Institute does, and then we can open it up for discussion. So we're a nonprofit organization, and what we do is research, demonstration, and education around agroforestry. And we really want to show people what's possible with agroforestry because this isn't a super common practice in our area. I wasn't really familiar with it before I started working at the Savanna Institute. But because we're a nonprofit, we're able to do some things and kind of take on some of the risks that it doesn't really make sense for other entities to do. So some of the things that we're doing, it doesn't really make sense for an individual farmer to do. It doesn't really make sense for a graduate student at a university to study because these crops take too long. And doesn't necessarily make sense for some government agency to be working on. So as a nonprofit, we really have the ability to kind of take on some of the risk that it doesn't make sense for other people to take on. And hopefully people can learn from our mistakes. And like I said, hopefully people can kind of see what's possible. We want to de-risk agroforestry for other people. And kind of getting back to our roots and the reason the organization started, we just want to bring people together who want to know more about agroforestry. Because like I said, it's not that common. We want to just get people together where we can kind of learn from each other. So some of the things we actually do, we do provide direct one-on-one support to landowners who are interested in establishing agroforestry. This is available for folks in Wisconsin and in Minnesota. We're hoping to make this available in Iowa and Illinois as well, maybe Michigan. We're looking to expand it, but right now it's available. There's no charge for this service, but you can fill out a form and start working with a technical assistance provider if you have land in Wisconsin or Minnesota. Let's see. This is a relatively new thing, but we are working on putting together a network of farms in Wisconsin and beyond that are doing agroforestry, because there are more of them. And what that looks like right now is that it's an email list that we're kind of managing, but basically it's an open list where anyone can email anyone in the group. You can buy, sell, trade, share news, help wanted, things like that. It's just a point of connection for people who are already doing agroforestry on their farms. About 5 years ago now, we also kind of spun off a business. And this came from working in agroforestry and seeing some of the needs and some of the things that needed to be done that weren't really a good fit for us as a nonprofit. We were realizing that some landowners just want to be able to hire somebody to come in and plant their trees and do all the establishment the same way you would for like a prairie planting or a food plot or crops or something like that. And another big need right now too is for nursery stock. So root stock, seed stock, things that people can buy and plant. So Savanna Institute and some of our partners helped start this business called Canopy Farm Management, which does exactly that. They are a farm business that can just come in and establish agroforestry on a piece of land. They also have a plant nursery that is selling a lot of the crops that we work with. And then the third thing they have, which might be of interest to some of you, is they've built a thing called Canopy Compass, which is a free online resource that will print off a map of any piece of land you choose. And it's a crop suitability map. So it goes through all of the main crops that we work with and using publicly available data on climates and soils, it'll kind of give an estimate on how suitable your land is for these crops. It doesn't mean your crops won't grow there, but it can tell you if you're planning to plant 100 chestnut trees, for example, that maybe you shouldn't plant them in this spot, you should plant them in this spot. So that's another resource you can find on the Canopy website. And then I'll try to briefly talk about our farms in the Spring Green area because they're so close right here. This is also fairly recent. Again, we're a young organization, but as we were kind of growing and starting to do more research on some of these long-lived tree crops, we realized that if we wanted to be able to plant these trees and know that we could have access to them for the foreseeable future, it would be important to have some land somewhere that the Savanna Institute owned where we could do some of this long-term research. And so in 2020, with the help of some neighbors and partners, we were able to buy North Farm, which was the first one we got. In case this map is hard to see, here's the town of Spring Green. I think you can see the Wisconsin River. So over the course of a few years, we ended up purchasing 4 properties in the Spring Green area. And this is the only land that Savanna Institute owns. We have other partner farms, we have other demonstration farms, but this is the only land that we own. And we're pretty well at capacity there, so we're sticking with that. But anyway, so North Farm was the first one we purchased. Then we have Valley Farm, which is really close to town. So we have 2 north of the river and 2 south of the river. And all these farms look a little bit different, and all of them serve a little bit different purpose. So North Farm, which is the first one that was purchased, back in 2020. This, I would say, is our demonstration of a commercial scale tree crop production. So this is where we're really trying to show what it would look like if you wanted to grow chestnuts, which is what is in this area here, growing chestnuts, or hazelnuts, which are the ones that are more visible over there. If you wanted to grow them at a pretty sizable scale and try to make money at it and try to have it be a successful enterprise. This is a commercial scale tree crop production farm. We're also doing silvopasture at this farm. We've got cattle here, you can see them. We have sheep. We're also starting to look at doing some timber management. We're doing oak savanna restoration. There's a small fruits orchard. There's really a lot going on at this farm. I sometimes think of it as the shock and awe farm because this is the one that people come to and their eyes get really big. It's like, oh
What's
man,
the acreage?
there's a lot going on here.
What's the acreage?
I would have to look that up too. I don't want to get it wrong. The interesting thing about this farm is it is almost a complete watershed. So it's basically just this whole valley here going up to the ridges. So it's kind of the ridges on down. And then right across the road, so it's on Highway 60, and then right across the road is the Wisconsin River. So we're doing some water quality studies at this site, and it's a really interesting location because we can collect water where it drains under the highway and know that pretty much all of that water came off the farm that we're managing. So yeah, that's an interesting feature of the farm. If you drive Highway 60, you'll probably see it. Valley Farm is pretty close to town, and this one is easy to find because it is right across the road from the Spring Green Preserve, if anyone's been to the TNC property out there. It's right across the road. This one looks very different. It's very flat, and this is where we're doing most of our research. This is kind of the research-focused farm because it's so flat, it's very uniform. It's a good place where you can plant two different types of trees or shrubs and know that any differences between them are probably due to genetics and not to the fact that they're growing under different conditions. So this is our research-focused farm. It's very flat. We have all kinds of stuff growing there. There's a big hazelnut planting, which is kind of the green area right here. We've got a bunch of persimmons growing in this area here now. We've got elderberries over here, blackcurrants over here. This is kind of a nursery area, so
These
lots of
commercially
growing
grown then? Are you doing it for commercial sales also?
I don't, this one is pretty research focused, so I think most of what they're harvesting off here, they're analyzing and measuring and growing out for something else. Hillside pastures, so now we're on the south side of the river. This is an interesting one because this farm was already in agroforestry when we purchased it. So this is a farm that was owned by a couple named Daniel and Linda Marquardt. Daniel was a grazer who raised red Devon cattle, and he started establishing a silvopasture by subtraction in this forest area right here. You can kind of see it here. You can see these trees have been thinned. But Daniel and Linda, their family ended up having some health problems and they realized they weren't going to be able to stay on the farm. They were hoping to find someone who could kind of continue this agroforestry that they had started. And we were able to work it out that Savanna Institute was able to take that on. So we're continuing to use this silvopasture that the Marquardts established. We're also planting trees on this farm. And a neighboring farmer named Michael Dolan is doing the grazing on this farm. And then we're also using the house that the Marquardts built, which is in a pretty prime location. We're using that as a place where we can host community events and then also as a rental space. So I think that's kind of an interesting idea. People talk about liking agroforestry and liking trees because they're beautiful and because they're nice to have as a view, and that's all very nice, but that also translates in some cases to being a financially viable thing that people are willing to pay for. So I think it's important that trees make us feel good, but it's also can be an enterprise in itself. And then the last farm is right near Hillside Pastures. It's just down the road, and that's South Farm here. This is the one that's maybe I think we've done the least work on this farm, just because the other ones have kind of gotten the attention. We are doing some grazing on this farm. A neighboring farmer, Eric Cates, is grazing on this farm. And then we have been doing some row cropping on this farm, which is what had been happening prior to us buying it. So a local farmer is also doing some of that. But as we start planting more trees, we're going to slowly phase out of that. So those are the 4 farms. Again, this is kind of the layout, and that's the story of the Spring Green Campus. We host events there throughout the growing season, so if you're interested in seeing any of these farms, we'll have opportunities for folks to come out and see them this coming year. And then the last thing I want to say, that you've been a very patient audience, if you're at all interested in these topics and want to learn more, our perennial farm gathering is coming up in less than a month, almost exactly a month, in Dubuque, Iowa. So tickets are on sale. It'll be 3 days. There's now going to be a 4th day that we're not managing, but that will be focused on hazelnuts. So if you want to know more about agroforestry in the Midwest, there's no better place to learn about it than at the Perennial Farm Gathering. So with that, thank you for listening to me talk. Those are all my slides, but I'm happy to take questions or comments or have some discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. Talk a little bit about economics, both your own economics in this era of subtraction of resources from agriculture in our current era, and how that's going with you and with the farmers, and then also the economics when you approach a farmer. How do you pitch that this might be in their interest? I mean, because they're used to going, fence row to fence row, the biggest machinery they have, and how do you talk about the economics of cutting that back?
Yeah. Well, I guess I can start with the Savanna Institute economics a little bit. Because we're a nonprofit organization, we do have an annual report that we publish that has details on our funding and our expenses. In general, our funding comes from public grants, private foundation grants, and donations. And speaking very broadly, I'd say it's kind of like a third, and a third. We have seen some of our public grants from USDA go away, come back, go away again, be very murky here this past year, which is making us really try and focus on looking at the donation side of things and how we can generate more donations. But we have had some pretty big grant projects that we've been a part of over the last 5 or so years. And I'd say some of the big projects that have really kind of fueled the growth of the Savanna Institute, we've really built out our research program. So thinking about the farms and some of these different tree crops we've chosen to focus on. We've gotten some pretty big grants to do some of the actual R&D on crops like hybrid hazelnuts, hybrid chestnuts, elderberries, black currants, persimmons are some of the big ones we're focusing on. And then our technical service program, like I mentioned with the one-on-one technical assistance, that was one of the programs that's kind of been in and out over the past year. At one point it was available in 6 states, now we're down to 2 states. But that's a program that we added a lot of additional staff, and providing that one-on-one support free of charge has been a pretty big project. So that's a little bit of our funding background. And in terms of, I guess, the motivations of working with farmers and landowners, I would say we're in kind of a lucky situation, I guess, where I feel like usually people come to me and tell me why they want to do agroforestry. We're still kind of at a point where we're still finding early adopters. So thinking about kind of the curve of adoption, agroforestry still seems to be in that early adopter phase, and that's something we're talking a lot about now. Is so much of what we do is kind of geared to these people who are interested in trying new things, who have the financial security to try some new things. That's been kind of our core audience, and thinking about what we need to provide differently to get some of those middle adopters who might, they need to see that this is going to pay off for them, or they need to know that they have the community support to do agroforestry. that's maybe not exactly the question you were asking, but that's something we think about now as an organization is, yeah, we're working a lot with those early adopters who are already kind of bought in on agroforestry, and trying to kind of think more about the needs of some of those middle adopters who might be interested, but want to kind of see a little bit more proof, see a little bit more evidence of it out on the landscape.
And are the markets developed for these products, or are they, if I grow it, will I sell it?
That's a complicated question. So a lot of these, let me back up. As the research team was growing, they put together a list of, 30 or 40 different perennial crops that could grow in the Midwest. And they looked at a lot of different things, including markets, including whether it could be machine harvestable, all these different things. And that's how they kind of picked out these half a dozen that we've chosen to work with, like chestnuts, hazelnuts, elderberries, blackcurrants, persimmons. These seem to be most ripe for expansion or growth. And so a lot of these are crops that we import more than we export. So theoretically there is a demand for them, but there are all these bottlenecks. And like you say, for a lot of these crops, if you grow them and harvest them, there's nowhere to take them. So we don't have the processing facilities, we don't have the infrastructure built up so that in the way that people could just take their grain to the elevator, you can't harvest your chestnuts and just take them somewhere and get a price for them. So that's why we exist, is to try to kind of find these bottlenecks and figure out what we need to do to make it possible for people to get hazelnuts that were grown in Wisconsin as opposed to grown somewhere in Europe or Asia.
Is there a certain number of farmers that you have already signed up, or you have goals to acreage or numbers? How do you measure your trajectory going forward?
There are a lot of different ways we could measure that. I think a good one will be this, the Midwest Agroforesters Network that I mentioned with the email list. I think as we kind of start building up that network and people are interacting with each other, that would be a pretty good measure of how many people are already doing this in the Midwest. Yeah.
Is there an argument to be made that you're going to diversify crops, and clearly that's good for the landscape? Is there an argument that it will also help nutrition locally?
I think there definitely is. Yeah, that is a big hope. I think it's interesting to think about some of these crops, especially the berry crops like elderberries, blackcurrants. I don't want to go on too much of a tangent here, but one of the nice things about these berry crops, they're perennial crops that have all the same benefits, but you can start harvesting them in a year, 2 years, 3 years. So for people that really are looking for financial returns, some of these shrub crops might be more interesting than tree crops. Elderberries are kind of growing in popularity for their immune system benefits. They have a lot of nutrition benefits. Blackcurrants as well, we're kind of in the midst of trying to put together some type of marketing campaign for blackcurrants and some other berries for their nutrition benefits and health benefits. So blackcurrants have more vitamin C than an orange, and it grows right here. So I think that's a really exciting thing, is to be able to grow some of these nutritious crops right here in our climates, in our soils.
I have a follow-up question.
Yes.
Are you familiar with the REAP food group?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can stay after class and talk. I don't know a lot about it.
Okay, that would be great. I know they've worked with some of our staff.
They're trying to diversify and get better nutrition locally, and they would love to. They do work with some farmers.
Okay.
And so it seems like if you can get kids in town better nutrition and farmers a better revenue stream,
Yeah.
on a landscape in which only 5% of the crops are eaten by people. Most of it's fed to cattle or put in a gas tank. So I think I can talk to you about REAP a little bit.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
You said your background was in wildlife originally, kind of, and I want to go in that direction.
Yeah.
You're setting the table for the increasing deer herd when you're planting all these little things, particularly the berries, and the birds. And also one of the difficulties in managing land all of us think about is, okay, what are we managing for? One thing that it's good for, then it hurts something else. And specifically what comes to mind with your presentation are the windrows of trees and bushes.
Yeah.
And the whole mantra is get rid of those because the predators will hang around in there and they'll go after the grassland birds. So it's become, it is an issue in our household, that sort of thing, and I know it is with many people.
Yeah.
How do you address that?
Yeah.
And has it come up?
It has. My graduate work at UW-Madison was looking at whether we could use cattle grazing to remove shrubs and trees from grasslands in the central sands and then also in southern Wisconsin for the grassland birds. Because as we know, there are some grassland bird species that will not tolerate a tree anywhere near them. So yes, I don't think we should be going out planting chestnut trees in the Buena Vista grasslands in the central sands. But I think our goal with agroforestry is that we're not trying to compete with prairies. We're not trying to compete with folks who are doing habitat restoration. We're trying to provide something that could offset some of the annual crops that are dominant on the landscape. But that is a tension that we run into. Just trying to think about
the deer.
The deer will come.
Yes.
We use some different types of fencing around the places where we have our more valuable tree crops. Some of the crops the deer don't bother as much. Some of them they do. The manager of our demonstration farm in Spring Green likes to say that everything loves chestnuts. Deer will eat them, raccoons will eat them, every animal wants to eat a chestnut because they're just so sugary. So depending on what type of crop you're planting, you might need to do some type of deer protection. And as you say with the birds too, for these berry crops, sometimes birds can be a concern. So in the more intensive production, people will work with netting over the top. There's a whole spectrum of things you can do depending on how much money you have invested and how much you need to protect it. But yeah, it's all part of the picture, and one of the goals is we want to have a place, we want to have habitat for more wildlife, I think, at least for me. So I don't know if that answered your question exactly, but
You showed those tree tubes, that's deer protection.
tree tubes can be deer protection, yeah, and livestock protection, in case I didn't explain that too. So you can have the tree tubes, and if you wrap them with electric fence, then animals will only touch them once. Yeah.
What's your experience with the chestnuts as far as disease, and are you successful in growing them? And also, I'm hearing more and more about hazelnuts and really the good possibilities for growing those. What's your experience, and do you think private landowners would do well to put in more hazelnuts?
Those are good questions. So with chestnuts in particular, one of the big things we're looking at, and with these research trials in Spring Green, is we're doing cold hardiness trials. Because for chestnuts, we really are kind of at the northern limit of where we would expect them to grow. And in dealing with climate change, that line is getting more and more blurry. But that's a big part of what we're trying to do, is grow these trees out. Like I said, try to take on some of the risk so we can let people know, like, maybe these varieties are okay, maybe these varieties aren't. With these tree crops, you need to know in advance, because they might start out looking good, and if 10 years down the road suddenly they're not looking good, then that's 10 years that could have been better spent growing something else. So we're looking at the cold hardiness with the chestnuts and with the hazelnuts. I know we were talking earlier about Jason Fishbach, who's with UW Extension, and is involved in the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative, which we're involved with as well, and that's really looking at growing hazelnuts in the Upper Midwest all the way up. I mean, Jason's in Bayfield or near Bayfield, Wisconsin. They kind of have their own climate up there. But another thing that reminds me of is with some of these crops, and hazelnuts in particular, one of the big barriers to profitability is machine harvesting. So trying to find varieties or trying to find the machines that makes it possible to harvest these all at once in a pretty big batch, because that really opens up opportunities. And with the hazelnuts, one of the things they're looking at is growing them as a hedge instead of as trees. So then you have a hedge you can drive along with some type of harvester. They have these already in parts of Europe, and it'll shake or grab the nuts off, and you'll have a harvester. I think that answered all your questions, but
Are the chestnuts growing, or are you having problems with them dying?
the
so far?
chestnuts, I would say, are doing surprisingly well. Better than we thought, the ones in spring green. They came bursting out of the tubes. And we're just kind of waiting to see how that changes, or if that changes over time. You know, we've had a few winters recently that were really mild. We had a pretty hard freeze this winter. We've had some winters that have been pretty rough. So we'll wait and see, but at the moment they seem to be doing well.
Are they hybrids?
These are hybrid chestnuts, yes.
Are they resistant to chestnut blight?
Yes, so that is, they've been hybridized with the Chinese chestnut, which has the blight resistance. That's another thing I'll mention. I think a lot of these perennial crops have some history of a blight or disease or pest or something coming in and really knocking them back in a bad way. And there are a number of crops where we're trying to recover from that in some form. You've got the eastern filbert blight. Yeah, there are others I could think of, but that's something we're working on with these. It's not just the climate, but thinking about what are the diseases, what are the pests, what are the things that are coming, and are we going to be ready for
Yeah,
that?
but with current, I'm thinking white pine goes to rust.
Yeah, yep.
You
So
know,
that's
we're not gonna get your white pine.
right. Yeah. So the ones we're growing have white pine, I guess you would say resistance, because they're kind of a secondary host. But yeah, so thinking about the diseases and the pests is a big part of the challenge with these crops.
Where did the name Savanna Institute come from, if it's not from Oak Savannas?
It was inspired by the oak savannas. So thinking about that as kind of the model. When we look at farms where we're doing agroforestry, if you kind of squint, does it look like an oak savanna? Do we have these spaced trees with things growing underneath, roots in the ground all year long, animals, herbivores underneath? Is it kind of functioning like a savanna ecosystem? And that's kind of what we're hoping to see.
I know a lot of the grape growers, the vintners out in California and things, have sheep in between the rows of grapes, so they're doing essentially agroforestry, aren't they?
That's a good question. I don't.
Or wouldn't you consider that?
Yeah, I guess based on my definition, that would be
It's not
agroforestry.
different from
Right.
elderberry or something.
Yeah. Yep. Yes.
Two questions.
Uh-huh.
Do you have any idea what the overall size is of some of your test plots? And the duration of those?
And the duration.
Just any ballparks? I mean, you've got a number of farms.
I would go back. I don't want to throw out a number because I don't know the exact number, but these are two vehicles, if that helps give the scale. So that's our hazelnut planting over there, and then the chestnut silvopasture next to it. So some of these are pretty good size, I would say. And what's that?
They're real field scale.
Yes, and that is a big part of, I think that's something that kind of distinguishes us, is there are a lot of people who are doing really cool agroforestry and some of the food forests, edible food forests on really small scales, like 1 acre, 2 acres, which is great, and there are a lot of people doing that. Our focus is more on field scale agroforestry. So thinking about some of these fields in Iowa and Illinois where we want to start making our way in with some of these windbreaks and alley crops, we need systems that can function at hundreds of acres.
My other question had to do with black locust, and my
Yes.
understanding is that Savanna Institute for a while was looking at that also as a field scale crop. What happened?
That is one we've looked at a little bit. We can't grow it in Wisconsin.
Yes.
It's, again, with some of our farmers in Illinois, when they were interested in timber trees, in some of the alleys, they are growing some black locust because it is a timber tree that there is a market for. So those are in annual crop fields that get tilled around them all the time, and there's not really anywhere nearby it can escape to very easily. So there are some really great things about black locust, and there are some really nasty things about black locust, and I say that as someone who has cut down a lot of black locust sprouts in my day. So that's another interesting part of agroforestry that we probably don't have time to get into now, but some of these trees that we're used to thinking of as weedy trees are trees that do have agroforestry benefits. And I know another one that comes up is mulberry, and that's another one that is a no-no tree in a lot of places in Wisconsin. We have a staff member in Virginia who's really interested in raising trees that can provide food for pigs, and mulberries are really great because they're really hard to kill. Everything that makes a tree a real nuisance can also make it really good for silvopasture where it's getting browsed really heavily. So that's another tension that I end up hearing a lot about is sometimes the things that make a tree a nuisance in some cases can make it useful in other situations.
So you're focused mostly in the upper Midwest, but there are people all over the country.
I mentioned Virginia, that's kind of an outlier. Most of us are in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota. I'd say is where most of us are located.
Must be very hard to get those Illinois farmers to switch because they're so wedded to debt, corn, pesticides, debt, corn, pesticides.
Yeah, I mean, these big farms are really bought into the systems they have, and it's really hard to start something new. And so we're trying to work with them to look for opportunities like windbreaks, like some of these timber trees and alley crops. I will say some of the nice things about working with these big farms is if you put in a windbreak or an alley and you get a GPS just right, they can put it in their tractors and their combines and they can go right along it because they are doing the precision agriculture and they can just put all that stuff right in their system. So yeah, there's some interesting overlap there. Yeah.
I'm trying to understand the different, what if I have 20 acres of apple trees all lined up in rows crowded in there? Am I practicing agroforestry with that?
I would call that agroforestry.
You would, okay.
That could also just be called orcharding.
Yeah.
I think sometimes that's a little bit of a blurry line to it when agroforestry just becomes having an orchard.
Well, your hazelnuts and things, that's basically an orchard, isn't it?
Mhm.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I think with agroforestry, if the focus really is just growing those apples or whatever it is, if I wanted to make it fit the agroforestry definition a little bit better, I would either grow something underneath the trees or have some type of livestock.
Take out every other row and put something in there.
Yeah. I think that would make it fit the definition a little bit better.
But I thought an apple orchard would, because if you're doing hazelnuts and persimmons like that,
Yeah.
they are trees.
Yeah, you got it. Yes, sir.
Hazelnuts seem like they would lend themselves to alley cropping. Is anybody doing that?
Yes, and that was, I just moved my picture and I shouldn't have done that. At North Farm, where we have the hazelnuts planted, that was one of the first things they planted there, and they've been alley cropping them. So in between the hazelnuts, they've grown storage vegetables. So they grew carrots, potatoes. Those did really well. It was like the first things that got harvested off the farm because none of the tree crops were ready yet. It's weird to tell people you're doing agroforestry and you've got all these pounds of potatoes you want to sell them afterwards, but
That's totally consistent with agroforestry.
yeah. So we've got some of the storage vegetables. I forget what else they have. They're growing some prairie as an alley crop at this point, doing prairie strips. You can also cut hay in between alleys. There's a lot of different stuff you can do, especially with hazelnuts. Yeah.
We live in an urban setting, but we are growing hazelnuts all over the place. They're really easy to grow.
Mm-hmm.
Do it for cuttings and whatnot. The squirrels get very damn.
But they replant them too, so it's.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some serious pest pressure with some of these.
You're dealing with an enormous amount of data with all this research and seems like a lot of balls in the air. How do you manage all of that? Is that done centrally?
Yeah, our research team is working on that. I don't have an exact answer for that, but I know when I go to the office and in the downstairs, they have a giant computer that is very scary to look at just because it's so big and there's so many moving parts. I'm guessing that's where a lot of the data is being analyzed.
Is that cranked out in reports or something, or?
Yes.
Is it in-house?
No, so the research team publishes in peer-reviewed publications, and then we have a lot of information on our website. So I probably should have mentioned this earlier. We have print guides for our 12 most popular perennial crops. Those are all freely available on our website. We've got more info about the 5 agroforestry practices. Yeah, we're trying to translate all of that data into things that are useful for people who might want to grow these crops. And probably one of the best examples of that is the canopy compass that Canopy Farm Management has on their website, where you can go and print the crop suitability maps, because that's a whole lot of data getting summarized for you and translated into a simple map of should you plant this here or should you not plant this here.
I don't think native species are, I mean, you're not trying for native species on any of this. Maybe the timber you are, but. So hazelnuts, I think, like there's a native hazelnut, but it's not that great for
Right.
eating. It's the hybrid ones that are good to, you know.
Yeah. A lot of the crops that we're looking at harvesting, fruit or nuts, are some type of hybrid,
Yeah.
where again, we're trying to get some disease resistance, but also trying to get cold tolerance. So those are often not native species, but we often have native versions of a lot of the crops we're growing. Like elderberries, we have wild American elderberry you can find anywhere. And for some of these windbreaks and alley crops, we are working with some native species. Like I think I mentioned, we're planting oaks in some of these alley crops in Illinois. So we do occasionally work with native species, but for the tree crop improvement side, that's often some type of hybrid. Yes.
Okay, well.
Thank you very much.